Welcome to the Crazy Alchemist podcast, where alchemy, occultism, and strange history come alive.
On the night of December 29, 1610, the highest judicial authority in the Kingdom of Hungary arrived at Chaktice Castle with armed men. Later accounts would claim he found the countess drenched in blood, bodies scattered through the halls, a torture chamber running with evidence of unspeakable crimes. His own letter to his wife tells a different story. He found one dead girl and one injured girl. He arrested Elizabeth Báthory while she was having dinner. That gap between the letter and the legend is where the entire Báthory case lives, and what you choose to fill it with says more about you than about her. Elizabeth Báthory would become the most infamous woman in European history, credited with murdering anywhere from 80 to 650 young women, accused of bathing in their blood to preserve her youth. She would inspire more horror films and novels than any other historical figure except Vlad the Impaler. And the most damning detail of her legend, the bloodbaths, was invented 118 years after her death by a Jesuit priest who never saw a single trial document. This is what the documents actually say. It is also the story of what was done with a wealthy, politically inconvenient widow in a kingdom where the crown owed her money it could not repay. She was born on August 7, 1560, in Báthory, Hungary, into one of the most powerful dynasties in Central Europe. The Báthory family had produced kings, cardinals, and palatines. Her uncle Stefan Báthory served as Prince of Transylvania and later as King of Poland. The family controlled vast territories from Krakow to the Ottoman frontier. Elizabeth was educated in Hungarian, Latin, German, and Greek. By the standards of her time, she was formidably intelligent. At 14, she married Ferenc Nadasdy. Over 4,500 guests attended the ceremony at the palace of Vranov nad Toplo. It was a political match. The Nadasdy family was military nobility, wealthy but newer to prominence. Elizabeth's social standing was higher than her husband's. She refused to change her surname. Nadasdy gave her Chaktice Castle as a wedding gift. Ferenc earned the nickname the Black Knight of Hungary, fighting the Ottomans in the Long Turkish War. He was known for courage in battle and extreme cruelty to prisoners. He was away for years at a time. Elizabeth ran everything. For nearly 30 years, she managed the estates, adjudicated disputes, maintained one of the largest households in the kingdom, raised their 3 children, corresponded with scholars and neighboring nobles, and defended their lands during wartime. Her surviving letters, over 70 of them translated by legal historian Kimberly Craft from the Hungarian archives, document a meticulous administrator. Livestock counts, crop management, land disputes, political negotiations. In one letter, she demands punishment for men who robbed an old woman and raped her daughter. In another, she berates staff for stealing her hemp crop. The letters are, in Craft's assessment, shockingly mundane. No guilt, no cruelty, no hints of what she would later be accused of. Just the daily work of keeping a vast estate functioning while her husband fought the Ottomans. Then her husband died. Ferenc Nadasdy died on January 4, 1604, of a sudden illness during a military campaign. With his death, Elizabeth Báthory became one of the wealthiest widows in Europe. She also became a problem. King Matthias II owed the Nadasdy Báthory estate a substantial sum in war loans that the crown could not easily repay. Elizabeth was Calvinist in an increasingly Catholic Habsburg sphere. Her family was politically exposed. Her cousin, Zygmunt Báthory, was imprisoned in Prague Castle that year, and in March 1610, months before her arrest, there was a failed assassination attempt on another Báthory relative, the Prince of Transylvania. The family controlled fortresses that could, in the wrong circumstances, be used against Habsburg interests. Elizabeth had no husband to shield her. Within a few years of Ferenc's death, rumors began to circulate. Servant girls were dying at Čachtice Castle. The Countess was torturing them, killing them. The question historians still debate: were the rumors true or were they useful? To understand what happened at Čachtice, you need to understand the gymnasium. In early modern Hungary, major noble households functioned as finishing schools. Families of lesser nobility sent their daughters to prominent estates to learn courtly etiquette, household management, and social graces. In the winter of 1609, Elizabeth opened a gymnasium at Čachtice. Noble families were eager to send their daughters to be educated by one of the most prominent women in the kingdom. This matters for two reasons. First, it explains why so many young women were at the castle at all. The sinister reading, she lured victims to her castle, and the practical reading, she ran a finishing school, describe the same physical arrangement from opposite directions. Second, it explains the timing. Deaths of peasant girls could be ignored by authorities. Deaths of noble girls, whose families had political standing, could not. The gymnasium opened in 1610. The investigation began in 1610. In March 1610, Palatine Georgi Thurzo ordered two notaries to fan out across the region and collect depositions. By the time the investigation concluded, they had collected testimonies from over 300 witnesses. The depositions described beatings, burnings, needle torture, cold exposure, binding with cord. They described girls who entered Čachtice and never left. The evidence had problems. Much of the testimony was hearsay, people who had heard things from other people who had heard from servants. When witnesses claimed to have seen bodies, the numbers were vague and inconsistent. No physical evidence of torture or murder was formally presented at the trials. Elizabeth herself was never permitted to testify. No character witnesses were allowed. The servants who actually worked in the castle were not independently questioned. They were arrested alongside their mistress and interrogated under torture before testifying. A revisionist scholar named Irma Sadetsky-Kardas, writing in 1993, went further. She argued that among approximately 300 witnesses, there were no victims who had actually been hurt and no eyewitnesses who had seen the events themselves. She also proposed that some described torture procedures correspond to legitimate 17th century medical treatments: bloodletting, cauterization of wounds, lancing boils during documented plague and typhus outbreaks. Deaths coincided with local epidemics. This is a strong claim. It does not explain the volume of testimony or the consistent pattern across multiple witnesses, but it raises a genuine question. In a century when medical treatment and torture sometimes looked identical, how do you tell the difference from 300 second-hand accounts collected by men with a political mandate? On the night of December 29, 1610, Thurzo arrived at Čachtice. According to his own letter, one dead girl, one injured girl. He arrested Elizabeth at dinner. He then detained 4 of her servants, her childhood nurse Ilona Yo, a washerwoman called Dorko, a young servant called Fitzko, and a woman named Katarina Benitska. What he told Elizabeth's guests and the local people, he had caught her red-handed. These two accounts, the private letter and the public declaration, do not match. Something was happening at Čachtice. The question is what, and on what scale? There is a figure at the center of the Báthory case who almost never appears in popular retellings, and she may be the most important person in the entire story. Anna Darvulia was a servant from the Nadasdy household who became part of Elizabeth's inner circle from 1601 onward. Sources describe her variously as a witch from Sarvar, a healer who specialized in surgery and bloodletting, and possibly Elizabeth's lover. During the servants' trial, the other accused consistently blamed Darvulia. She had taught them the methods, they said. She had taught Elizabeth. She was the instigator. Darvulia died of a stroke in early 1909 after having gone blind. She was never tried and never questioned. A dead person cannot defend herself, and she makes a convenient scapegoat. The servants were tried on January 2 and January 7, 1611. All four had been tortured before testifying, standard practice for the era, but devastating for evidentiary reliability. They confessed to helping their mistress torture and kill young women. They shifted blame to each other, to Elizabeth, and to the dead Anna Darvulia. The sentences were immediate and extreme. Ilona Yo and Dorko had their fingers torn out with red-hot pincers, then were burned alive. Fitzko was beheaded, then burned. Katarina Benitska, who claimed she had acted under coercion, received life imprisonment. A critical detail documented by historian Tony Thorne. No one outside Thurzo's group was able to question the witnesses because they had all been executed immediately. A Hungarian lawyer, a descendant of Thurzo himself, later examined the case and concluded the evidence would not stand up in a modern court. Elizabeth Báthory, charged with 80 murders, was never put on trial. This is where the political machinery becomes visible. King Matthias II wanted a public trial and execution. Under Hungarian law, conviction of a noblewoman would enable confiscation of her estates by the crown. This would have eliminated the royal debt in one stroke. The Hungarian Protestant nobility wanted to avoid this outcome. A public trial would disgrace one of the most prominent families in the kingdom and set a precedent for royal seizure of noble lands that every landed family in Hungary would oppose. Thurzo brokered the compromise. Elizabeth was confined to Chaktice without a public trial. Her estates were divided among her children, and the family canceled the debt owed by Matthias in exchange for managing her captivity. The correspondence makes the timeline clear. On December 12, 1610, 17 days before the arrest, Elizabeth's son-in-law wrote to Thurzo, referring to an agreement made earlier. On February 12, 1611, after the servants had been tried and executed, he wrote to Thurzo thanking him for choosing the lesser of two evils, noting his judgment had preserved their honor and shielded them from too great a shame. The deal was negotiated before the arrest took place. The crown's debt disappeared, the family kept the lands. Elizabeth spent the rest of her life in prison. She never confessed to anything. Elizabeth Báthory died on August 21, 1614, at Chaktice Castle. She was 54 years old. No cause of death was recorded. She died alone. For over a century after her death, she was a footnote, a disgraced noblewoman imprisoned for unspecified crimes. No legend, no horror. The trial records were sealed by the Báthory family. Then in 1729, a Jesuit priest named Laszlo Töröcsy published a history of Hungary, and everything changed. Töröcsy introduced the detail that would make Elizabeth Báthory immortal. She had bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. According to this account, she had once slapped a servant girl whose blood splattered on her skin. The Countess felt a rejuvenation and from that moment began systematically killing young women and bathing in their blood. There was no evidence for this. It appeared in no trial record, no testimony, no contemporary account from the 17th century. Töröcsy either invented it or collected it from folk legend that had developed over 118 years since Báthory's death. Context matters. Töröcsy published at the height of the Habsburg vampire panic of the 1720s and 1730s, the same decade that produced the famous Arnold Pauli case and the broader Hungarian vampire hysteria that swept through the same territories where Báthory had lived and died. The cultural moment made blood narratives marketable. The trial witness accounts were rediscovered in 1765 and published for the first time in 1817. They contained no references to bloodbaths, but by then the legend was already established and actual documents could not compete with the story. The most quoted number in the Báthory case, the one that earned her a mention in the Guinness World Records, deserves its own examination. The official charge was 80 murders. The figure of 650 comes from a single piece of testimony at the 1611 trial. A servant named Susanna claimed that a court official named Jacob Silvasi had seen the number written in one of Báthory's private books. Here is what is wrong with this. The book was never produced as evidence. Silvasi himself never mentioned it in his own testimony. It is pure hearsay, one person claiming another person saw something. No such diary has ever been found by any historian. The official count remained at 80 because the higher figure could not be substantiated. The 650 entered the popular record through repetition, not evidence. Each retelling treated the previous retelling as a source. The number became a fact by accumulation, not by proof. Honest engagement with this material requires presenting both cases at full strength. The case was guilty. Over 300 witnesses testified. The depositions describe a consistent pattern of torture across multiple years and locations. 4 servants confessed. Even accounting for torture, their descriptions are specific and interlocking. Thurzo found a dead girl and an injured girl at the castle. The sheer volume of testimony spanning years and regions is difficult to explain as pure fabrication. The case that she was framed, the confessions were extracted under torture. Much of the testimony was hearsay. No physical evidence was formally presented. Elizabeth was never allowed to testify. No character witnesses were permitted. The political motivations are documented in the correspondence. The crown owed her money. Her family was being targeted. The deal was negotiated before the arrest, and the debt conveniently disappeared. The bloodbathing legend was invented over a century later. The 650 figure is based on hearsay about a document that never existed. The scholarly field has shifted since the 1980s. Laszlo Nagy and Josef Kocsis argued for political fabrication in 1981. Irma Sadecki-Cardos analyzed the trial as a show trial with nearly no reliable evidence in 1993. Kimberly Kraft, who spent years translating the complete trial transcripts and over 70 of Elizabeth's private letters from the Hungarian archives, occupies the most measured position. She presents the primary sources and leans toward accepting that some abuse occurred while documenting the serious problems with the evidence. The truth, if it exists, is somewhere between these readings. Some abuse likely occurred at Chakhtitse. The scale was almost certainly exaggerated. The bloodbaths are a fiction. The 650 is a fiction. The political motivations are documented fact. And a woman who managed one of the largest estates in the kingdom, who demanded justice for raped peasants in her letters, who refused to take her husband's name and educated her daughters, was locked in a castle for 4 years and has been called a monster for 4 centuries. Both things can be true at once. That is where an honest account must sit. If you found this worth your time, the full article is at crazyalchemist.com, along with the trial documents, the political correspondence, and the scholarship behind everything you just heard. New episodes every week. Thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to visit crazyalchemist.com for more intriguing content and follow Crazy Alchemist on Instagram and Facebook to stay connected.